I can't do this. I can't spend my life taking care of a man with nothing left to offer.
Nobody here is surprised, Callum. They're just too polite to say it. Then say it. Sign this. Walk away from the Renshaw name. It's the only thing anyone's ever asked of you that you might actually manage.
The board already voted. He's everything you were supposed to be.
You were never the heir. Just the placeholder.
She didn't hesitate. She pulled that ring off like it had been inconveniencing her for months, turned her back on me in front of everyone who mattered, and reached for my brother instead. Everett took that moment like he'd rehearsed it. He had the paperwork ready. He had the board's blessing locked in. He had everything he believed I no longer deserved. What neither of them understood, standing in the certainty of their victory, was why a man with nothing would choose silence over surrender. So what exactly had that silence already set in motion? If you've ever been written off by someone who didn't bother to look closer, this story is for you. Subscribe and stay with this channel because what happens next is something neither Sabrina nor Everett saw coming. The morning of my wedding, I stood in front of the mirror in a rented suite at Belrose Conservatory and noticed that the cane leaning against the wall matched the color of my shoes. I don't know why that detail lodged itself in my mind. Maybe because it was the kind of thing I used to obsess over: precision symmetry, everything in its right place. I had spent 35 years believing that if you prepared carefully enough, life would hold its shape. That morning I still believed it. Belrose was the most elegant venue in Harborwick, Connecticut, and my mother had insisted on it. The guest list ran to 300 maritime executives, city officials, 2 state senators, and enough journalists to ensure that whatever happened inside those walls would find its way into print by evening. I remember thinking the size of it was unnecessary. Sabrina had agreed with me, or at least she had said she agreed, which at the time felt like the same thing. I had known Sabrina Kessler for 4 years. We met during the lowest stretch of my life in the rehabilitation wing of Harborwick General, 8 months after the accident that ended my career, my inheritance, and very nearly my life. She had walked in with flowers she'd bought from a hospital cart, sat beside my bed without being invited, and told me she admired how I kept showing up for physical therapy, even when I could barely stand. I was not accustomed to being admired for anything that year, and the feeling of it was more powerful than I knew how to account for. By the time I could walk the length of a corridor with a cane, I had convinced myself that Sabrina was proof that something real could survive everything I had lost. There was a great deal I chose not to tell her. Not because I didn't trust her, that is what I told myself at least, but because the secret I was carrying had consequences that went far beyond our relationship. 4 years earlier, before the accident, I had spent 18 months developing an artificial intelligence system capable of optimizing global supply chains, energy routing, and maritime logistics at a scale that no existing platform could match. I had built it quietly in parallel with my responsibilities at Renshaw Maritime, because I knew that if my brother Everett or my mother Lucinda caught wind of what I was doing, they would find a way to claim it as a family asset before I could protect it. What I didn't know until the night I nearly died on a rain-soaked bridge outside the city was that the threat was more serious than corporate jealousy. The car went off the bridge at 11:47 in the evening. I know the time because the tow report listed it, and I memorized the document the way I memorized everything that mattered. The driver, a man named Roy, was killed on impact. I was pulled from the water unconscious with 3 fractured vertebrae and damage to my lower spinal cord that the surgeons described with admirable restraint as significant. I spent 4 months in the hospital and another 8 learning to walk again. While I was doing that, my father Gareth died of a heart attack, and my mother convened the board of Renshaw Maritime and transferred operational control of the company to Everett, citing my medical condition as the reason. By the time I could attend a meeting unassisted, there was no meeting left for me to attend. What the board did not know, what my mother did not know, what Sabrina certainly did not know, was that I had continued building during all of it. I had taken the technology I'd developed, incorporated it under the name Orion Systems Group using initials only CR, and spent the 4 years since the accident turning it into one of the most significant infrastructure and logistics companies in the world. My attorney and chief executive Bennett Sutter managed the public face of the operation. The trust structure that held my ownership stake was deliberately layered. I was listed nowhere by name. To the city of Harborwick, to my family, to Sabrina, I was a former heir with a small technology consulting firm, a cane and diminishing relevance. That was precisely what I needed them to believe because I was not yet certain who had tampered with the brake system on my car the night Roy died. I intended to tell Sabrina everything after the wedding. That was the plan. That was the reasoning I used to explain to myself why I had allowed her to spend 4 years loving a version of me that was deliberately incomplete. I told myself it was caution. Looking back, I think I also wanted for once to be loved for the part of me that didn't come with a balance sheet. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. I arrived early. Nadine Weller was already there, seated near the back at my request. Nadine had been my physical therapist during the worst months of my recovery, and in the years since she had become the person I trusted most in any room. She ran a rehabilitation center on the east side of Harborwick, modest in size and exceptional in quality, and she had no idea that Ariane had been quietly funding the facility's operating costs through a third-party grant structure. I had arranged it because the work she did deserved to continue, and because I could not find a way to tell her that without explaining everything else. She had never asked where those grants came from. Nadine was not the kind of person who looked for catches. When the processional music started, I stood at the altar and watched Sabrina walk toward me in a dress that had cost more than most people in that room earned in a month. She was smiling. I remember the smile in particular because it was the one she used at business dinners, precise, maintained, pointed in the right direction. I had seen it enough times to recognize it. I told myself I was being ungenerous. People are nervous at their weddings. Smiles go mechanical under pressure. I told myself a great many things in those 2 minutes. The officiant read the standard language. He reached the part about intention and commitment, turned to Sabrina, and asked her if she would take me as her husband. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not grief, not guilt, something closer to relief. Then she reached down, slid the engagement ring off her finger, and turned toward the 3rd row of seating on the right side of the aisle. Everett was already standing. He came forward in a gray suit, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who had practiced the walk. Sabrina took his arm. The room went entirely silent in the specific way that rooms do when something has happened that no one has the vocabulary for yet. My mother sat in the front row with her hands folded in her lap, and she did not look surprised. Sabrina spoke clearly enough for the room to hear. She said she had stayed as long as she had out of obligation, that she was not willing to sacrifice her future out of sympathy for a man who had no money, no career, and no real prospect of physical recovery. She said Everett was the future of the Renshaw family and that she intended to be part of it. Everett then addressed the room rather than me, which was a choice I noted without surprise. He announced that the board of Renshaw Maritime had that morning formalized his position as sole heir, and that as a gesture toward clarity, he was asking me to sign a document relinquishing whatever remaining share interest I held in the company. The document was already on the altar rail. He had placed it there before the ceremony started. He introduced it as a gift to the occasion. My mother spoke briefly from her seat. She said that Sabrina deserved a partner who could provide for her and that she hoped I would understand this was not a reflection of my worth as a person. It was the most damage she had ever done to me while trying to sound kind. I stood there and understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that every person in that building who shared my name had come prepared. The paperwork, the board announcement, the language Sabrina had used, none of it was improvised. This had been arranged. All of them had known what this day was actually for before I walked in. The room held 300 people and not one of them stood up. Then someone moved in the back. Nadine came down the aisle at a measured pace, no particular urgency, and stopped beside me. She didn't look at Sabrina or Everett. She looked at me and asked quietly enough that only I could hear whether I could walk out under my own power or whether I'd rather have company for the exit. I picked up my cane from where it rested against the altar rail and lifted the unsigned document and held it out toward my brother without looking at it. Everett reached for it. I let it drop before his hand made contact and it fell to the floor between us. Then I took the engagement ring that Sabrina had set down on the rail, walked 3 steps toward her, and placed it in her open hand. I told her without raising my voice that from this moment forward, every choice she made was her own to live with. Nadine and I walked out together through the main entrance of Belrose Conservatory past 300 people who had the decency to stay silent as we left. The afternoon sun was stronger than I expected. I stood on the front steps for a moment, and while Nadine went to get the car, I took out my phone and sent a single message to Bennett. Begin the audit. Stop protecting Renshaw Maritime. Bennett called me that evening. He had been waiting for the word for months, he said, and he did not editorialize about the wedding. What he told me instead was that the financial picture at Renshaw Maritime was considerably more precarious than the family understood. Over the previous 4 years, Orion had quietly extended favorable shipping contracts, embedded proprietary logistics software into the company's operations at no cost, and maintained a line of credit that Everett's management team had been drawing against without knowing its origin. The arrangement had been my decision. My father's employees, the dock workers, the freight coordinators, the operations staff who had nothing to do with board politics, had families and mortgages and pension contributions that depended on the company staying solvent. I had not been willing to let them absorb the consequences of my family's incompetence. Bennett estimated that if Orion withdrew its support entirely, Renshaw Maritime would become insolvent within 3 weeks. The immediate calculation was obvious. I could go public before the week was out. Bennett could arrange a press conference, release the ownership documentation, and let the city of Harborwick understand that the man Sabrina had abandoned at the altar that afternoon was the majority stakeholder of a $65 billion technology and infrastructure company. I could watch Everett's board announcement collapse in real time. I could let Sabrina understand exactly what she had walked away from in the specific numerical terms that apparently constituted the only language she found persuasive. I told Bennett to hold. The document Everett had brought to the ceremony contained electronic signatures in fields that I had never accessed. I had not provided authorization codes to anyone outside of Orion's internal systems, and the codes embedded in that paperwork matched a format I recognized. Someone with inside knowledge of my digital infrastructure had generated those signatures. Everett was not technically sophisticated enough to have done it alone, which meant Sabrina, who had spent 4 years inside my home and several months before the engagement increasingly interested in the details of my work calendar, had given him something. I didn't know yet what she had taken. But the coordination required to stage that ceremony, the timing, the board vote, the forged documentation told me that today's events were not the conclusion of a plan. They were a step inside a larger one. If I revealed myself now, whoever was behind this would go quiet and careful. If I stayed invisible a little longer, they would keep moving. I called Nadine after I got off the phone with Bennett. I told her I needed access to my medical records from Harborwick General, specifically the incident file from the night of the accident 4 years ago, and any documentation related to the vehicle inspection that followed. I did not explain why. Nadine was accustomed to me not explaining things immediately, and she was also perceptive enough to understand that I was asking her to trust me without full information which she had every right to decline. She said she would see what she could find, and then she said something I did not expect. She told me that the desire to make someone pay for what they'd done to you was a legitimate feeling, but that she had worked with enough people in crisis to know that when revenge became the organizing principle of a person's life, they tended to become a version of the thing that had hurt them. She wasn't telling me not to fight. She was telling me to be careful about what I was willing to become in the process. I thanked her and said I would keep that in mind. I don't think I fully heard her that night, but I remembered it later in the moments when it mattered most. I sat alone in my house after the call and thought about what the day had actually been. 300 people had watched my brother take my fiancée and hand me a document to sign away my own name, and not one of them had moved. My mother had sat in the front row and told me to let it go. Everett had looked at me with the satisfaction of a man who believed the outcome was permanent. Sabrina had walked out on my arm that morning as though she was still deciding something, and I understood now that she had decided long before today. What none of them had accounted for was the text I had sent from the front steps of Belrose. The audit was already running. The support structures holding up Renshaw Maritime were already being reviewed. The clock had started, and I was the only person in the city who knew it. I picked up my cane, walked to the window, and looked out at the harbor. Somewhere out there, Renshaw maritime cargo ships were moving under contracts that bore my company's invisible fingerprint. Everett would spend tonight celebrating. Sabrina would spend it believing she had made the right calculation. I was content to let them. 3 days after the wedding, Sabrina appeared on a local television program with the careful composure of someone who had rehearsed her grief until it looked spontaneous. I watched the segment from my kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold on the counter. She told the interviewer that she had spent years managing the emotional volatility of a man who used his injury as a mechanism for control, that she had walked on eggshells inside our relationship, that leaving had been an act of self-preservation rather than betrayal. She did not raise her voice once. She had always been at her most persuasive when she was completely still. Everett's media strategy followed within 48 hours. His family's connections ran deep enough in Harborwick to shape the narrative quickly, and the version of me that emerged in those early days was a man consumed by resentment, a displaced heir trying to poison his brother's prospects through backroom interference and wounded pride. The coverage wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. In a city built around a single industry reputation moved through professional networks faster than any press release. And by the end of that first week, I was fielding dropped calls from consultants I'd worked with for years. My mother's contribution arrived through the courts. Lucinda filed a motion requesting that my remaining share interest in Renshaw Maritime be transferred to Everett, supported by a psychiatric evaluation she had commissioned without my knowledge and a declaration from 2 board members stating that my decision-making had been erratic since the accident. The filing used language I recognized as deliberate words like capacity and stability, chosen specifically to make the legal argument and the personal one simultaneously. I forwarded the documents to Bennett without comment. He called me back within an hour and said the filing had problems, but that it would take time to dismantle properly, and that time was a resource Everett was counting on running down. The thing about being publicly portrayed as unstable is that there is almost no response that doesn't appear to confirm the characterization. Anger reads as volatility. Silence reads as guilt. I chose to say nothing publicly, which was the correct strategic decision, and also the most difficult thing I had done since leaving the hospital 4 years earlier. Sabrina came to my house on a Thursday evening 11 days after the ceremony. She knocked, rather than using the key I had never asked back, which told me she had prepared for the conversation in advance and wanted to begin it with the appearance of restraint. I let her in. She sat at the kitchen table where she had eaten breakfast 100 times and folded her hands in front of her with the same precise posture I had seen on television. She told me the situation had become complicated in ways she hadn't anticipated, and that there was a straightforward path through it for both of us. If I signed the transfer documents Everett had presented at the wedding, she would retract the public statements about control and emotional abuse. She framed it as an exchange between reasonable people, which was the version of events she apparently needed to believe. I asked her if she had ever loved me. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, she said that she had believed in the beginning that I would recover my position at Renshaw Maritime, that she had seen something in me worth investing in. But over time, as it became clear that my health had imposed permanent limitations, and that Everett had consolidated control in a way that wasn't reversible, she had understood that what she'd been investing in no longer existed. She said it without cruelty, which was somehow worse than if she had been cruel. Cruelty would have been personal. What Sabrina offered was an accounting. I was about to respond when I noticed Nadine standing in the hallway entrance. She had come to drop off a folder of documents from Harborwick General, the medical records I had asked her to locate, and I had left the front door unlocked. She had heard enough. She looked at Sabrina with an expression that was not anger and not pity, and then she set the folder on the hallway table and let herself out without a word. I asked Sabrina to leave. After she was gone, Bennett called with something that shifted the entire frame of what I was looking at. Our internal security team had completed a review of access logs for my home office systems, cross-referenced against the authentication records for Orion's proprietary network. A device, a physical token generator, tied to Orion's document verification infrastructure, had been accessed 14 times from inside my house during the 10 months of our engagement. The last access was 4 days before the wedding. The device itself was missing from the secure drawer where I kept it. It could not be used to move money or access accounts. But in the hands of someone who understood what it generated, it could be used to produce verification codes indistinguishable from my own authorization signatures, exactly the kind of codes embedded in the inheritance documents Everett had placed on the altar rail. Sabrina had not simply chosen my brother. She had been inside my systems for nearly a year. The Harborwick Global Infrastructure Conference was held every 18 months at the convention center on the waterfront, and this cycle's agenda had been organized around a single headline. Orion Systems Group would be announcing its first public leadership disclosure ending 4 years of anonymous operation. The timing had been planned before the wedding, and I saw no reason to change it. If anything, the events of the previous weeks had clarified exactly why the reveal needed to happen in this particular room in front of this particular audience. Renshaw Maritime had requested a meeting with Orion's executive team as part of the conference proceedings. The request had come through official channels routed to Bennett's office, asking for consideration of a long-term contract renewal. Everett, Sabrina, and my mother arrived together and took seats in the third row. I watched them from a monitor in the prep area backstage. Everett was wearing a new suit. Sabrina was positioned half a step behind him in a way that read as deliberately supportive. My mother sat with her hands in her lap and the practiced composure of a woman who had spent decades in rooms like this one. Before the session opened, Sabrina spotted me crossing the lobby and said something to Everett that made him laugh. She called across the space that she hoped I had found something useful to do with my afternoon. It was said lightly with the particular edge of someone who believes they are completely safe. Bennett took the podium at 2:15 and delivered the introduction in the measured cadence he reserved for high-stakes rooms. He spoke for approximately 4 minutes about the history of Orion, the scope of its operations across 31 countries, the infrastructure contracts it held with 7 national governments, and the trust structure through which its founding stakeholder had maintained privacy for reasons that would now be explained directly. Then he stepped aside and nodded toward the door to the right of the stage. I walked out. The room had 340 people in it, and the silence that followed was different from the silence at the wedding. That one had been stunned and uncomfortable. This one was the specific quiet of people recalibrating everything they thought they understood. The screen behind me displayed the ownership structure of Orion, the trust layers, the holding entities, and at the center of all of it, my name next to a net asset figure of $65 billion. I did not look at Sabrina immediately. I looked at the room and let the room look back. When I finally let my eyes move to the third row, Sabrina was completely still. The expression on her face was not the composed grief from the television interview. It was something rawer and harder to manage, the specific look of someone watching the foundation of a decision collapse in real time. Everett's jaw was set in anger. My mother had closed her eyes. Everett stood up before I finished my announcement. He said the technology underlying Orion had been developed using resources and intellectual property belonging to Renshaw Maritime, that I had built a $65 billion company on assets that belonged to the family, and that he intended to prove it. He said it loudly enough for the room to hear, which told me he had prepared for this contingency. He had not expected to use it today, but he had prepared for it. I noticed Nadine near the back of the hall. She was standing rather than seated, and she was watching me with an expression I recognized from the early months of my recovery, the particular attention of someone taking in more information than they're showing. She knew now. The version of me she had spent 4 years knowing as a struggling consultant with a modest practice and a difficult family situation had just been replaced by something she had no frame for. I understood even from across that room that the problem was not the money. The problem was that she had believed we were navigating the same kind of difficulty from the same kind of position, and I had allowed her to believe it. I announced that Orion would be conducting a full financial audit of Renshaw Maritime, that all existing contracts protecting the company's workforce would remain in place pending review, and that any executive compensation arrangements or asset transfers executed in the past 4 years would be examined for irregularities. I kept my voice level and my language precise. The facts laid out cleanly were sufficient. Everett filed the lawsuit 4 days later. The legal theory was straightforward in its construction that the artificial intelligence system at Orion's foundation had been developed using proprietary data server infrastructure and research resources belonging to Renshaw Maritime, making the company a rightful co-owner of the technology and its derivatives. The stolen authentication device gave him the means to support the argument. His legal team had used it to generate documents that appeared to show Orion's early technical architecture being accessed from Renshaw Maritime servers during the period of my recovery. The court issued a temporary injunction, freezing a portion of my voting rights in Orion pending a hearing on the ownership claims. The board of directors, reading the news coverage and watching the company's stock price drop 14% in 2 trading sessions, voted to suspend my public operational role until the litigation was resolved. I was still the majority stakeholder. I still controlled the trust. But my ability to act publicly on behalf of the company had been removed by the people I had built it with because they were afraid, and fear is a more reliable motivator than loyalty in most boardrooms. Meanwhile, Nadine had been working through the medical records and accident documentation from Harborwick General. She found a mechanic named Dale Pritchard who had serviced the vehicle I was driving the night of the accident. She met with him at his shop on the south side of the city, and he told her without much prompting, and with the effect of someone who had been waiting for the question, that he had been paid by an intermediary to replace a brake valve with a defective component. The payment had come through a shell company. Nadine had traced the shell company's registration documents back far enough to find a connection to Everett's personal financial accounts. Before Dale Pritchard could be interviewed by anyone with legal authority, he recanted. His statement was withdrawn within 48 hours of the initial conversation. His family had relocated out of Harborwick by the end of the week. I learned from Bennett that my mother had known about the brake system before the accident report was finalized. She had used her standing with the department to ensure the investigation concluded with a finding of weather-related mechanical failure. Gareth had been on the verge of formalizing my succession at Renshaw Maritime. Everett had moved to prevent that from happening, and Lucinda had protected him afterward. The picture was now clear enough that I could see all of its edges, but the centerpiece, a credible witness with evidence that could survive legal scrutiny, was gone. When the news broke about Nadine's involvement in the accident investigation, it was framed as a conflict of interest. A recipient of Orion's undisclosed funding had been conducting private research to benefit Orion's founder. The story had been fed to a media outlet by someone with access to Orion's grant records, which meant the leak had come from inside the company. Nadine's rehabilitation center lost 2 of its 3 major independent donors within a week. The 4th floor of the facility, which served patients recovering from spinal injuries, had to reduce its intake capacity because the staff couldn't be paid. She came to my house the night the last donor called her. She stood in my front room and told me she was not leaving because of the money. Not because she was angry about the size of the gap between the version of my life I had described and the version that had appeared on a conference room screen. She was leaving because I had made her a participant in a war she hadn't consented to fight, had allowed the people she served to become collateral in a conflict she hadn't been told existed. She said that she understood why I had kept the secret, and that she believed my reasons had been genuine, and that none of that changed the fact that genuine reasons and good outcomes are not the same thing. I wanted to tell her she was wrong. I could not find the argument. She left. The door closed behind her with no particular force, which was somehow more final than a slam would have been. That same night, the storage unit where Bennett had been keeping physical documentation related to the accident printed records. The original photographs from the vehicle inspection correspondence from the weeks before the crash burned to the ground. The fire department listed the cause as electrical. Dale Pritchard's name was not in any of their reports because Dale Pritchard was no longer in the state. I was in the hallway of my house when my spinal injury flared, the particular kind of pain that announces itself not as a sensation, but as a structural failure. The body withdrawing a permission it had been granting on tolerance for years. I went down against the wall and stayed there on the floor in the dark for a long time, unable to get myself upright without something to brace against, and there was nothing close enough to reach. I had $65 billion in a trust structure with my name on it. I could not stand up. I could not produce a witness. I could not protect the company I had built or the woman who had been honest with me when no one else had bothered. The audit was running and Everett was still free, and the floor of my hallway was cold in the way that floors are cold when you've been on them long enough to notice. I lay there and thought about what Nadine had said to me the night after the wedding when I had called her and she had told me to be careful about what I was willing to become. I had thanked her and not fully heard her. I was hearing her now. I got myself off the floor by bracing against the radiator near the baseboard. It took longer than I want to account for. When I was upright again, I stood at the window for a while with my hand on the sill and looked out at the harbor lights reflecting on the water, and I thought about the difference between a man who has lost everything and a man who has simply not yet moved. The distinction mattered. I had spent 4 years allowing people to confuse the two. Everett's offer arrived through his legal team the following morning, a formal settlement proposal structured with the precision of something that had been drafted over several weeks. The terms were clear. If I surrendered operational control of Orion and withdrew every claim related to the accident investigation, he would terminate the civil litigation, restore the grant funding to Nadine's Rehabilitation Center through a Renshaw Maritime charitable vehicle, and guarantee that no workforce reductions would occur at the company for a period of 3 years. If I refused, his attorneys would seek to extend the injunction, indefinitely pursue the intellectual property claim through every available appellate channel, and ensure that the litigation timeline stretched long enough to destabilize Orion's government contracts beyond recovery. I had built the offer carefully. Every leverage point was something I actually cared about. That was how I knew he had help. My mother came to my house 2 days after the proposal arrived unannounced, which was her preferred method when she wanted to make a conversation feel spontaneous. She sat in the same kitchen chair Sabrina had used and looked at her hands for a moment before she spoke. She told me the family had been through enough. She said that Everett was not a bad person, that he had been young and frightened when he made the choices he made 4 years ago, and that the accident had been a terrible error in judgment rather than an act of malice, and that protecting him afterward had been the decision of a mother who had panicked. She framed all of it as context rather than justification, which was the most honest she had been with me in years, and it still wasn't honest enough. I asked her a single question. I told her that for as long as I could remember, she had treated my survival as something that needed to be accommodated around Everett's advancement, and I wanted to understand how she had made that calculation, how a mother arrived at the conclusion that one son's life was a reasonable cost of entry for another son's inheritance. She looked at me for a long time. She did not answer. She picked up her bag, stood, and told me she hoped I would make the right decision for the family. She meant Everett's family. She had stopped considering me part of it some time ago, and we had simply been performing otherwise. Nadine called me the evening after my mother's visit. She said she had heard about the settlement offer, that the terms relating to her center had been described to her by someone in Everett's circle, who apparently believed she would find them persuasive. She was calling to tell me the offer had not changed her position. She was not asking me to refuse it in order to protect her. She was also not asking me to accept it in order to make her situation easier. What she said after a moment was something closer to a question than an instruction. She asked whether I understood the difference between punishing Everett and holding him accountable, because in her experience those two things felt identical at the start, but led to entirely different places. I told her I thought I was beginning to. She said she would come by in the morning, and that she had something I needed to hear. When she arrived, she set a phone on the kitchen table and played me a recording. It was the conversation she had with Dale Pritchard at his shop, the session I knew about, the one that had preceded his recantation. But she had recorded the full exchange, not just the portion she had summarized for me. What I heard on that recording went further than what she had described. Dale Pritchard had named the intermediary who had approached him. He had described the payment structure in detail and referenced a specific account number. He had also mentioned, almost incidentally, that he had received a follow-up call 3 days before he recanted a call that had come from a number registered to one of Everett's personal assistants. The recording was not the clean testimony of a credible witness. Dale was gone and the recantation was on record. But the account number he had cited matched a transaction string that Bennett had flagged months earlier when auditing the shell company's financial structure. Together, they were not sufficient for a criminal conviction. together with the authentication device logs, the access records from my home systems, and the document trail Bennett had been quietly assembling since the wedding, they were sufficient to reopen a closed investigation. Bennett had also spent the previous 3 weeks working with Orion's internal engineering team to reconstruct the development logs from the company's founding period. Every build record, every version timestamp, every code commit had been stored in an encrypted archive on Orion's primary servers, a redundancy measure I had insisted on years earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with litigation and everything to do with the fact that I had learned not to trust single points of failure. Those logs showed with the specificity that only raw engineering documentation can provide that the core architecture of Orion's system had been developed and version controlled before any data from Renshaw Maritime had been introduced into the platform. The intellectual property claim Everett had filed was not just legally weak, it was factually false, and the timestamps proved it. The logs also showed something else. They showed the exact date, time, and terminal location of every access event involving the stolen authentication device. 14 sessions, each one traceable to a specific IP address. Each one timed to periods when Sabrina had been alone in my house while I was traveling for client work. The documentation did not name her. It didn't need to. The pattern was its own argument. Sabrina called me directly 2 days before the shareholder meeting. She said she needed to talk, not as adversaries. I let her speak. She told me that the legal situation had evolved in ways she hadn't anticipated, and that Everett's attorneys had been in contact with her about her potential exposure in the intellectual property case. The authentication device access logs had apparently been shared with Everett's team as part of discovery, and rather than using them only to support the claim against me, his attorneys had structured the filing in a way that made Sabrina the primary actor, the person who had physically accessed the device, executed the sessions, and transferred the information. Everett's name appeared nowhere in that section of the filing. She had been positioned as the architect of a scheme she had participated in as an instrument. She said she had documentation. 11 months of messages, call logs, and written instructions. Everett had sent her specific directions about what to access, when to access it, what format to save the output in, and where to deliver it. She had followed those instructions because she had believed she was helping consolidate a straightforward inheritance transfer. Whether that distinction would reduce her legal exposure was a question for her attorney. What it meant practically was that she had evidence that made Everett's involvement explicit and her own role derivative. She asked if I would help her. I told her I would not interfere with whatever arrangement she reached with prosecutors. I told her that if her documentation was genuine and she chose to provide it to the relevant authorities, that decision was hers to make on its own terms, and that she should make it based on what was true rather than on any expectation of my involvement. I told her one other thing before I ended the call. I told her that the most painful part of what had happened between us was not that she had chosen someone else, and not even that she had helped take something from me. It was that she had looked at me for 4 years and seen only the question of what I was worth in the room's terms, and had never understood that I had been something else entirely the whole time. She had been trying to calculate the value of a thing she never actually looked at. She had nothing to say to that. The documents she surrendered to the district attorney's office 2 days later included a text message chain running to 412 exchanges, a series of voice memos Everett had sent with specific technical instructions, and a wire transfer record showing a payment from Everett's personal account to a number that matched one of the entries in Dale Pritchard's recorded statement. The shareholder meeting was held in Orion's main conference facility and streamed live at Bennett's insistence. I had agreed to the live format because I wanted there to be no version of that room that could be edited afterward. I stood at the front of the space, same cane, same measured pace, and I spoke for 40 minutes. I did not perform regret about the secrecy that had surrounded Orion's founding, but I acknowledged it plainly. I had chosen to remain invisible because I believed I was in danger, and that choice had consequences for people who deserved better than to be kept in the dark. I presented the engineering logs. I presented the authentication access records. I presented the financial trail connecting the shell company to Everett's personal accounts, and the shell company to the brake valve replacement, and the brake valve replacement to the specific component failure that had sent my car off a bridge on a rain-soaked night 4 years ago with Roy in the driver's seat. I did not editorialize. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when people are doing the work of revising their understanding of a long period of time. The board voted to restore my operational authority before the session ended. Everett was arrested the following morning on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. Sabrina was charged with accessory to fraud, unauthorized access to protected computer systems, and concealment of evidence. She entered a cooperation agreement and received a reduced charge structure. I did not call anyone on her behalf, and I did not contact her attorney. My mother was removed from Renshaw Maritime's board, pending a separate investigation into her role in suppressing the original accident inquiry. Renshaw Maritime passed into the ownership of a labor trust structured by Bennett's team over the preceding 3 weeks. The workforce retained their positions, their pension arrangements, and their contracts. The Renshaw name remained on the letterhead because the people who worked there had earned it more than the family ever had. Everett's signing authority was revoked the same morning he was taken into custody. A year is not a long time for anything structural to heal, but it is long enough to tell whether the new shape is going to hold. Orion had recovered its stock position and exceeded its pre-crisis valuation by the end of the first quarter, following the shareholder meeting. The government contracts had been reinstated. Bennett had been formalized as chief executive with full public authority, which is what he had always functioned as, and he seemed to find the legitimacy clarifying. I purchased Belrose Conservatory 6 months after the wedding. The building had been on the market for less time than most people realized. The venue's management had been struggling with costs for 2 years before Everett had booked it. I paid a fair price. I then spent 4 months working with an architect and a clinical planning team to convert the interior into a rehabilitation and vocational training center for adults recovering from serious physical injuries. The conservatory's main hall, with its high ceilings and original stone floors, became the physical therapy wing. The smaller rooms along the east corridor became training spaces for transitional employment programs. Nadine became the center's director. I did not offer her the position as a way of bringing her back into my life, and she did not accept it on that basis. We had several direct conversations about the distinction before she agreed, and those conversations were more honest than most of the ones we'd had in the preceding 4 years. She accepted the directorship because the work aligned with everything she had built at the previous center, because the resources available at Belrose allowed her to serve more patients at a higher level of care, and because she had satisfied herself that the funding structure was transparent and her operational independence was genuine. Those were her terms. I thought they were reasonable. We rebuilt something between us in the months that followed, but we rebuilt it differently than it had existed before. There was less I was protecting her from, which meant there was less distance required. What grew in that space was slower and less dramatic than the version of connection I had imagined during the years when I was managing everything from behind a screen of careful omissions. It was also more durable. On the day the center opened, I arrived early and stood in the main hall while the staff finished the last preparations. The room looked nothing like it had on the afternoon of the wedding, and yet I knew exactly where the altar rail had been, the specific stone on the floor where Everett's paperwork had landed when I let it drop. The building holds its geometry regardless of what has happened inside it. Nadine found me there when she came in. She was carrying the morning's intake files and wearing the same expression she'd had in the back of the conference room during the shareholder meeting, taking in more than she was showing. She stopped beside me and looked at the same stretch of floor I had been looking at. I reached into my jacket pocket and held out a key, the physical key to the center's main entrance, one of 3 copies. She looked at it for a moment before she took it. I told her that the last time I had stood in this building, I had come with a ring for a woman who had spent 4 years calculating what I was worth and had never once asked what I wanted. I told her I was not interested in repeating that structure. What I was interested in was building something with a person who had met me at my lowest point and had somehow managed to see me anyway clearly and without revision and had stayed in the room until I was ready to see myself the same way. Nadine turned the key over in her hand. She said that was a reasonable place to start. We walked out through the main entrance together into the morning, and the door closed behind us on its own, and the harbor was visible at the end of the street, and I did not look back. I had stopped being the man left at the altar the moment I chose not to sign that document. Everything since then had simply been the work of becoming whoever came next. Sabrina left because she could only see what I was worth on paper. Everett took what he thought was mine without understanding what had built it. And my mother chose silence over truth for years, believing that was the same thing as protection. None of them were right. Being written off doesn't mean you've lost. Sometimes the people who walk away are simply the ones who couldn't see far enough ahead. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, subscribe to this channel. There are more stories here about people who were counted out and chose to rise anyway. Leave a comment below and tell us what would you have done standing at that altar with the paperwork in your hands. Ciao.